local hero type. But in any event, one piece of thing to announce is that several of these guys are involved in a new event that's taking place at UCSD, and that is here in San Diego, is going to be the home of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination. This is going to be very exciting, so sometime in about 6 months, go online and find out what some of the programs that may be involved, the lectureships and colloquia, seminars on the Starship Century, for example, and also on what is imagination, how we can leverage on it, maybe better teach the use of imagination to the youth, how to better compare imagination, what you imagine, to reality so that it does not become its evil twin called delusion, which we may be exercising right now in Phase 3 of the American Civil War. We'll see how that comes out in a couple of weeks.
Yes.
And the opposite end of the political and psychological spectrum.
Not political, my God. I'm a rabid unionist like all the other smart people in the world. Greg, I mean that Union Army, not. Grant was the best general, not Robert E. Lee.
In fact.
Greg Bear, science fiction writer, colleague of everybody up here, and we go back quite a ways. So these are the early memories of hard science fiction, and what we've heard from those who came before us.
So I pitched this panel because I want you guys to help me. I can't bring myself to write science fiction. I've got a science education. I've got a bachelor's in math, applied science with focus on cognitive science from UCSD. And I've taken all the physics classes, and I didn't take chemistry, but I've taken biology, psychology, all that. But to write science fiction, I would want to write hard science fiction. What I'm scared of is feeling quaint, because some breakthrough will happen that will nullify the big plot point that the entire novel would be based around.
You don't have to worry about that if you have genius.
Well, now I'm really worried. So my psychology aside, we'll talk a little bit about how science fiction ages and what happens to hard science fiction when the science trumps it. Start with that one. Is that a new genre? Do you still consider it hard science?
I think that the problem that you just described is very real, and it's perhaps unique to science fiction, and I think I worry about it because it does undermine other qualities of science fiction. On the other hand, hard science fiction writers now have had about 50 years of experience in what I call what is called future-proofing their writing. There are things you can do about your writing that probably go a long way to protect it, and protect it almost as well as the rest of the as the contemporary fiction genres, which also are going to look very quaint if you go forward 10 or 15 or 20 years.
Yeah, Jane Austen, for example. You know, we sometimes love quaintness, and this is a huge question. If you think that science fiction is other than art, if you think that science fiction must be predictive, must be serious and constructive, and must engage on the serious side of scientific progress, then you're going to be in real trouble with a story 10, 15, 20 years down the road in many instances. But if you say that science fiction is an artistic insight into the thoughts of the period, then you're doing the same thing as when you read a Dickens novel. You know, my God, this Dickens is quaint. People don't talk like that. They don't wear those clothes. They don't drive carriages. What's with this guy? Well, you know, why wasn't he up to date? When you read a Doc Smith book, you're looking into 1919 through 1950, okay? And when you say, okay, in the context of the time period, what was this artist thinking and doing that was new and amazing? And you have to, in a sense, like reading all literature, you must be a historian to get this. And if you're not a historian, if you're just a clueless enthusiast coming in and saying, this doesn't make any sense anymore. What is this, you know, bus bar that E.E. Smith keeps talking? I have no idea what a bus bar is. Well, you weren't doing electronics in 1932. You know? So I think we are really kind of going at a problem from a point of view of coming up against a wall of criticism from outside clueless people who don't know what science fiction is all about. And we just say, look, this is a period piece. You're reading a Raymond Chandler novel. Forensic psychology is nothing like Chandler nowadays. Get over it. Read it for what was great at the time, for how it still impresses and carries an emotional story, for the fairy tale aspects of it, the scientific fairy tale.
Yeah, it's still science fiction. I mean, one of the real advantages I've always found of science fiction over fantasy is that you can look at fantasy and nobody expects that to keep up to date. I mean, there are good contemporary fantasies, urban fantasies, etc. But it's very much, you recognize the ghosts and vampires and the elves and you know, spirits that cross from the underworld, a lot of familiar stuff. What I like about even old science fiction is that this is fantasy I can believe in. You know, essentially, I was at the Gaslamp Gathering, and you know, the steampunk. We're still, I guess, evaluating its science fiction credentials, even though it's been around for a while now. Tim Powers isn't out there by any chance, but
just have lunch with him.
okay, there you go.
He's alive and well.
I know, and a good person. But I still, to me, as much as I like certain kinds of fantasy, I still find the old science fiction. I mean, that whole idea that, I mean, steampunk really is an extrapolation from the science fiction of the 1890s, basically. And it's that extrapolative aspect. It does.
And it's Mary Shelley meets Jules Verne with more bronze.
Yeah. I mean, I like what you said, Greg, because I actually take home literature that way. I'm really interested in the historical context of even an F. Scott Fitzgerald or you know, an Ernest Hemingway or a Mark Twain, because it really does, if you know their audience and what, you know, memes they were addressing, the work actually makes more sense. So the science can go out of date, but the science fiction maybe doesn't.
The more you read and the older you get, and the more you make cross connections, the more science fiction merges into literature. So when you're reading The Great Gatsby and you hear about this Ashland or Land of Ash,
Yes.
that's where they're going to build the 1939 World's Fair. And that's the future, except the future is butting up against World War II, and these countries' pavilions are fading away just after they put them up. And this is a huge science fiction scenario. It's like H.G. Wells could wander into this and go, oh my God. You know, how could I not beat reality? Because this is happening.
Well, what's tragic is that H.G. Wells and Jules Verne were both the hard SF authors of their time, and yet so jealous over territory.
Yes.
That they failed to give us that great collaboration that we could have done otherwise. I think that, of course, it's been contended that science fiction should have been named speculative history for several reasons. First off, history is what a larger fraction of us read, whereas only about 1/10 of us are scientifically trained. And then there's those who, along with Kim Stanley Robinson, put some of us to shame in the hardness of their science fiction, and they were English majors. Because they refused to be bridled by I worked. Can you go get it?
I failed math, David. That's why I didn't.
Well, so did I. Only I failed it at Caltech.
Now that's a brag. I failed math. I'm better than anyone in the room.
But the other reason to call it speculative history is because if you think about it, science is involved in our plots only a fraction of the time. But history really is the arc that they were talking about, this context of the great story of where we were, or where we might have been, or where we might have wound up at this same point if things had been different, parallel universes, or the extrapolation of the story to the future. And it's often said we don't try to be predictive. Well, we try hard sometimes, but in fact, my fans keep a wiki just for the predictions from my novel Earth. And the score is very high with some real boners. And they've started another one for my new one, Existence. But the fact is that it's not so much the predictive aspect as the context, the perspective that complete these, as they were effective. In other words, the self-preventing prophecies. And among these, probably the most powerful was 1984. which girded millions of people to strive their whole lives to prevent it from coming true, to the extent that a normal politics in America, not the Civil War that we're in right now, but normal politics, a decent Republican and decent Democrat they are distinguished from each other simply by which elite center each thinks is striving to become Big Brother. The average decent Democrat is concerned about conniving aristocrats and faceless corporations. The decent Republican, when they existed, and there are many of you out there, but look up Gary Johnson, okay? The average decent Republican was legitimately concerned about faceless, snooty academics and faceless bureaucrats. And when you put it that way, the answer is, duh, let's guard each other's backs. Instead of what we're doing right now, which is to say, you are insane to believe that my elites could ever be a threat to freedom. But the point is that everyone uses this metaphor of Big Brother. You corporations are trying to become Big Brother. You bureaucrats are trying to become Big Brother. This is the shadow cast by George Orwell. And there were others. Harry Harrison, by the way. We should have, when you leave the room, pause and have a minute of silence for this great man who died just recently, one of our great peers. And I believe that Maycrew and Soylent Green recruited so many environmentalists that it may be why we're still here. The same, it might be true, it might be said of Dr. Strangelove. We might be here because of the cautionary tales pushed by science fiction. And Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. So, and both of whom passed away recently, but Harry Harrison didn't get a YouTube video like that one that Ray Bradbury got. Wow. If you don't know what I'm talking about.
Ray had been 10 years younger.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about steampunk and so compare it to Victorian science fiction, where Victorian science fiction was science fiction at the time. Maybe their understanding of science wasn't that strong. If they were off, that was their excuse.
Their understanding of engineering was pretty darn strong. They were building the bridges and the giant ships, and so that was their focus, was engineering, which is kind of lays steampunk down.
Yeah. But I would also throw the Invisible Man in there and
Frankenstein
as pseudoscience, and that what we call it. But
well,
at the time,
yeah.
Whereas a lot of steampunk, they don't have that excuse. They know the science better.
Right, they should.
I haven't read a lot of it, but some of what I've read sometimes is just, I want to write a fantasy book, but I want to have gears instead of magic.
Well, if you see the Invisible Man movie, which has just been re-released on a great transfer, the screenplay by R.C. Sheriff, another science fiction screenwriter and science fiction writer at the time, based on H.G. Wells' story while Wells was still alive, takes the scientific aspects of the problem and says, I cannot go outside without clothes on after I've eaten a meal. Because the food has to be digested to become part of me. Or if I'm walking through a snowfield, they'll see my tracks, which is of course how the movie ends. Or if I'm in a mist, you will see me like a kind of bubble. And these are quotes directly out of Wells. So Wells is like, yes, this is a fantasy concept. No, he couldn't see, I know that. Please get off my back. But we're going to have fun with the idea anyway. And that immediately, he throws the ideas out that are immediately accessible to the audience. And the audience is saying, well, what if? And then he goes, oh, what if? And the audience goes, yeah, I thought of that too. And suddenly you're in this science game playing with H.G. Wells' brain. Together, the popular audience can see this film, read this book, and go, I thought of that too. Aren't I smart? I mean, that's a pretty good technique for being a best-selling writer.
Yeah, Verne also did that. Not the Hey Verne guy, but I mean Jules Verne. He,
Werner I. Verne here.
yes, who, by the way, is the proper heir of Jules Verne, or maybe not. In any event, Werner will speak soon. But in any event, what Verne did was a wonderful formula for hard SF of his day, and that is, he said, I'm going to stand somewhere, and I'm going to pick a direction, random direction, and we're going to write a novel about people heading in that direction for a good reason. Let's see now, there, off in a balloon. There, whoa, I'm going to have to work on this one, going to the moon. There, under the sea. There, into the center of the earth. Vern basically would spin around, get drunk, spin around, point in a direction. When he woke up, wherever his finger was pointing, it had to be his next note. Very effective technique. Which obviously I use.
But I do wish I'd seen more of that kind of stuff in steampunk. I mean, I read a bit of it. I like the idea in theory, just this historical treatment of science fiction tropes. But a lot of them are ghost stories and things like that.
We get kind of that technological aspect in Blevon. He's kind of a pioneer, and he loves that scientific aspect of the early scientific stuff, the Rumkopf lamp and the, so there is that nostalgia for problems we could solve before quantum mechanics came along and made the world just as weird as anything else.
Werner, speak up.
Yes, there's also various tricks that writers in the 20th century brought to the game, and one of those that I think is not remembered sufficiently is Kipling's ABC stories. Those stories really show that he clearly understood the tricks that Heinlein is famous for, as the door dilated and things like that. He has in those stories an understatement and vagueness at the appropriate points, so that although the stories aren't nearly well enough remembered to support my praise for them, I think are really worth looking at. And I've never heard that Heinlein actually used that as a model, but whether or not he did, it's clear that more than anybody from that period that Kipling had a hold of that. On the other hand, Jules Verne, I agree with what you just said, David, and I was very struck some years ago I saw a picture of him from when he was in his 40s, and he really looked like Isaac Asimov. There's no special thematic connection, but it looked like Isaac Asimov, and it made me think it would have been really cool to be able to speak French, and even more importantly, to be able to go back and talk to him.
Well, I have been looking all over the place to get my hands on a copy of Mistress Brannigan, Verne's story, which is supposed to be set right here in San Diego, even though he was never here.
Yeah, we tended to do that. San Diego was a great place to set stories yet. On Werner's point, with the Night Mail, you have to read if you're a Heinlein fan, because not only is this is him saying to H.G. Wells, a Nobel Prize winner, tip of the hat, Kipling, to Mr. Wells, who's a best-selling author with huge repute. Hey, I can do this too, Herbert. Take a look at this. And he does this immense story about a near-future world in which dirigibles and everything are predominant. And then he does the whole astounding analog thing at the end by having the genre in the Saturday Evening Post, which Heinlein is going to be fitting into, but also Philip Wiley and so on. So yeah, there's a lot of material there for scholars to dig into.
Are we adequately talking about hard SF for you? Because I think that's and should we talk about how it ties in with comics?
Well, I wanted to see if we could save science fiction, and I think, besides myself, the people on this panel, I can't think of many more people qualified to do that. I want to try something here, and I need the audience's help with this. So we're going to do these 5-minute chunks, and hopefully this experiment works. I'm going to embarrass myself on video. So when I pitch, I'm going to throw out some of the standard science fiction tropes that science has not been kind to, and we're going to discuss and see if we can salvage them. All right, so you guys in the audience, start timing us, and after about 5 minutes, just start going like this. Right. So first,
you pick the person in the audience you want to answer. No, the person on the panel.
Oh no, well, let's make it an open session.
David will dominate an
All right. We get some sort of game show. I wish we had buzzers. Okay. Who wants to take on faster than light? Who can say faster than light travels?
Save.
Great.
It was never in peril. We've got 13 different physics papers each year that say, look at this. That's all science fiction. Because, you know, the whole notion of entanglements and so on, and then, oh gosh, we can get around that. You can't send information. Then here's how we do it. It's just a logical trick. We'll just get up over here now. We do that, and we wave our hands a little bit, and that's all it's ever been. That's all FTL's ever been.
So So how does that work in a story context? Like how would the whatever, I mean, it's not going to be engines, and it's not going to necessarily be warp drives, or how would it work?
Well, you start talking about how foolish those people in the early 21st century and the 20th century were.
There we go.
You don't have to say much more than that, because we're used to being wrong, and if you've mastered the English phrasing for dismissing things that everybody realizes is wrong. How could we be that stupid?
You know, I think the key to faster than light travel is extreme miniaturization, because it seems to work pretty well, maybe at the quantum level. I mean, there's some suggestion, entanglement and so on.
David, you were talking about the bloater drive. Can you explain the bloater, Harry Harrison's bloater drive, or was someone else talking?
No, someone else.
The bloater drive, Harry Harrison said, you can achieve faster than light travel by simply expanding your spaceship in the direction you're going until it gets to where you're going, bloating it out to where it reaches it, and then shrinking it from the rear. And that's the bloater drive, and it's amazing. And so you know, your frame of reference is instantly stretched beyond belief, and you get there where you want to be. The bloater drive.
Well, you may wind up having a few people who are then absorbed in the middle. They become parts of your bloodstream. They're not very happy. Yeah, people say that my uplift universe, you know, with dolphins in space and all that sort of thing, is hard SF. I don't consider it to be. Sure, there's a lot of science in it, and speculations in the context, but the context is completely free of the Fermi paradox. It's 5 galaxies filled with aliens when we know that's not the case. And as long as I'm playing without the net up, I might as well have one hyperdrive than I have dozens. I have lots of fun in that universe, offering, oh, and here's another one, oh, and here's another one, and here's another one. Because I don't take it seriously as hard SF. I take it seriously as my job to stimulate the hard SF parts of you. But that's a very different thing. It's an entertainment. Hard SF is these near future extrapolations, dealing with an Einsteinian universe. And so in my new novel, basically miniaturization is how they get around in that solar sails taking pellets this big between the stars. That's pretty much how interstellar travel takes place. Messages in bottles containing virtual aliens.
Arthur C. Clarke made a horrible mistake. He thought, he was told by biological experts, I think it was in Fountains of Paradise or one of his novels, and he wrote into the Science Fiction Writers of America Forum and says, I will give a YAG sapphire the size of your head to anyone who can get me out of this. I have a character who receives radiation damage, which is passed on to his offspring genetically. The genetic changes are passed on to his offspring. And that's not allowed in biology, he says. Now, I was dubious about that back when the biologists were telling him this, because there were probably instances in medical literature of mutations acquired by parents that are passed on to their children. And now we know it's common. It happens all the time. It's even mentioned in Aaron Brockovich, where hexavalent chromium can damage your genes in such a way that damage is passed on to your children. Why were biologists telling Arthur he was wrong? Because they believed they had the absolute factor. They were dogmatic in their no acquired traits. Please, no elephant man stuff. We will not deal with it. So poor Arthur wasn't wrong. And we know the phenomenon is correct. So sometimes when science fiction is wrong,
All right, here's another trope. Aliens. Looking pretty lonely out there.
Well, the Fermi paradox is something that, you know, I've been engaged in discussing from just about every position, including, you know, astrophysics. I've got some of the classic papers on great silence, which is what I called it before the Fermi paradox became its name. And that is the question of why we seem to be alone in the cosmos. And by the way, that seem, it could change tomorrow. But the issues of SETI and the Fermi paradox and all those types of things, well, I have major scoop-its filled with articles about this. If you go to my website, davidbyrne.com, go along the left side, you can find the little clickable about SETI and the search for extraterrestrials. But the point is, aliens are becoming more interesting, not less so, as time goes on. Some of the wonderful speculations that are going on, you take something, some aspect of humanity, and you warp it in a funhouse mirror. You say, what about the potential for tragic contacts that we know from our own history. Not just the history of humanity, with the Aztecs and Cortez and all that, but when the Panama Land Bridge lifted and all the marsupials in South America met all the placentals from North America, and all but a couple of the marsupials lost. This is without any aggression or any intentional organized aggression. So you can bring all of these things into your discussions of the alien.
I think Garner's created some of the finest aliens.
His time creatures are just absolutely amazing.
Unfortunately, it doesn't address the issue of the fact that of Fermi's paradox or the great silence. It doesn't contradict it, but it doesn't advance it. So I'm regretful of that. I think that we still have room for our aliens. We also have room for a lot of other possibilities. And actually, I thought that David, that your novel Existence is probably the most thorough in fiction or outside of fiction analysis of the artifact problem, which is or artifact issue. The fact that in addition to messages, if you look at the scope of geological time, that there ought to be things floating around in the solar system. Everything from candy wrappers that were put down in the Cretaceous by interstellar visits to things that actually might be sophisticated enough that we could still have a conversation with them. That idea has a lot of different angles on it, and the Existence certainly explored an enormous number of them.
So there's been a cleanup crew. We're in a national park zone, and the cleanup crew has come through and cleaned up the trails, and now all we have to find is the litter bin, and we're all three.
Which Stanislaw Lem did in World 70.
That was Strugatsky.
Yeah, that was
Strugatsky.
Right.
And that was great.
Great thing. Yes. So the alien trash is some of the alien hidden is what we really want to find.
All right, next trope. This is one that's dear to my heart because I studied in college. Artificial intelligence. Watson's looking pretty good, but I wouldn't call Watson really smart. I mean, if you set a fire in the building, Watson's going to sit there. He's not going to get out of the building. And that doesn't meet my definition of intelligence.
Fortunately, I wrote a paper on this, actually, after hearing Marvin Minsky speak once. He was at the artificial intelligence program, at MIT. And this was 20 years ago. He was, his strategy, their strategy, was to figure out everything that allows humans to have self-perception, the way we frame the universe, etc., and program that into a computer. And he was very sanguine about the sort of cyberpunk notion that we would eventually be able to download ourselves into computers that were as sophisticated as the human brain, you could perceive the world the same way. Unfortunately, the human brain so far has proved
How to describe and measure things in language, more formal branch of language. And the map is not the territory. Wittgenstein says language is not reality. The map is not the territory. Math will never be reality. And so therefore your computers, your computational systems, your brain is not a computational system. It's a socialized network of very, very high frequency and very frangible and variable molecules which cannot be simulated in any known computational system. The other thing I came up with long ago, back in the 80s, is if a brain is in a computer, what does it taste like? Can you tell what operating system you're operating under? And this is a fundamental theoretical problem which some computer scientists picked up and ran with. It says it is a theoretical problem. Can the program know what its operating system is or what sort of computer it's running on? If it can't, then maybe the matrix is real. If it can, what's the flavor that's optimal, Apple or IBM? So, but really the whole misconception of AI was renormalized shortly after Marvin did this, probably back in the 1960s, when they said, oh, we're talking about expert systems. And they've sort of got that now with language recognition and a few other areas. But an artificial intelligence is not a tool, it is a user. And that's been the terrible horror of all science fiction warning stories about artificial intelligence, is from the Golem to Frankenstein, is you're making a child. You better learn how to raise it correctly.
Yeah, that's one of the lessons of that we face in the question we face is in approaching the singularity is, will we make these things and will they turn around smarter than us and stop us flat? But in fact, we do have experience for thousands of years creating new intelligences that are smarter than us, and 99% of them don't turn around and stop us flat, except with sarcasm.
And creating them is more fun than programming generally.
Yes, programming is very difficult, line by line recoding, because they, they're our children. And Greg Bear and I and Greg Benford, the original Killer Bees, before upstarts with bees.
Werner was there before me, so.
No. It was the three of us, and then we got drunk last night and we were unable to tell our B's from our V's, and he slept in.
But you allowed in him John Harrison too, so I don't know what was going on.
We channeled, it's a B with the tops and bottoms cut off. We channeled Isaac Asimov, of course, and we did the second Foundation trilogy. And the question that Isaac himself was asking before he died was, what do you do when you have these three rigid laws, but the creatures that are embedded with these three rigid laws get smart enough to become lawyers? They'll interpret them any way they like. And I'm leaning more and more to the expectation that since this is what happened to us 100,000, 200,000 years ago, is that we extended childhood because you needed childhood, an extended period of experience to become truly intelligent, dealing with reality, rather than having it be pre-programmed. And if this is the case, then this may save us, because the AIs will have to spend 10, 20 years fostered out and raised in human families. And
I remember when he was just a toaster.
in which case we have a chance to have them think they're human and not stop us flat.
All right, next trope, time travel. Police box or accelerator ring the size of the solar system? What was that again? Time travel.
And what's the meta question?
Time travel.
Hey, is time travel, can we make that work in a story, in a hard science fiction story? Because things that aren't looking too good. I saw a story where somebody's got the math done, but it takes a ring outside the solar system to be able to accelerate something to the speeds that he needs to get there.
Actually, I don't.
Microphone's on the list.
That's time editing at work.
Actually, I don't have any trouble with. I had never written a time travel backwards story, okay, which is what I think you're ready to talk about. On the other hand, I have no trouble with the idea of writing things like that. I subscribe to the advice that you're allowed one crazy ass assumption, and then you try to play ball with it consistently. And actually, there are a number of consistent ways of playing with time travel. Unfortunately, very few people are interested nowadays, especially in movies and TV, very few people are interested in playing those out. But
Don't parallel for Dr. Who at all.
so parallel worlds, meshing that certainly does it. So does the notion of absolute determinism. And it's amazing what fun stories you can have if you have the notion that in fact this is the way it happened. And it's not like the Twilight Zone where this is the way it happened is simply an opening to talk about fate. It's the fact that if you can creatively balance your knowledge of the future with your ignorance of the future, you can get outcomes that are satisfying to you, but still satisfy the historical record. And that's a trope that really I think has only been exploited in the last 15 years.
Well, Werner, go ahead, please. Finish first.
As epitomized by, for instance, Cage Baker and her Garden of Eden stories.
Actually, the very first science fiction novel I ever started, my son is nagging me to drag it out. I was a freshman at Caltech, and it was my hobby piece in my sophomore year became the practice effect. But this one I've never dragged out. But the premise is that something terrible is going to happen. I think they predicted a giant solar flare, and the sun's going to go crazy in about 10 years. And scientists are disappearing all over the world. And this secret agent tracks it down, and they're all joining this conspiracy, and they're all heading to these freshly discovered caves in Peru that nobody has been inside. They simply found them from records, and they're forming an encampment near, but not going in the caves, and making these big machines. And it turns out what they're going to do is they're going to go back in time to this place where it's a lava field and go before the volcano was. And then they're going to spend the rest of their lives in as many generations as it takes to come up with a solution. And then they're going to bury that solution in these caves that have been discovered but not yet open. And then they are all going to move to this island that blows up. And that will fit.
That's very cool. And they bring along the world's most beautiful women. And the last line is, my graduate advisor, I can walk!
Yeah. They get into the caves and have a mine shaft.
That's right.
We've written the story.
Yes, I know. They're riffing off the greatest motion picture ever made.
Yeah. So here's
Dr. Strangelove.
Here's a trope that's tangential to time
Okay,
travel.
if I can mention the time travel thing, I have started 5 different time travel stories and never finished one yet because it causes corpus callosum meltdown between the critical scientist part of me and the artistic part. And I can make them work to play together in anything but time travel. And it starts with, I even have one that has the best opening line I ever had. When I was a kid, I thought all families were bothered by time travel. Great. I can't finish it.
We keep sending Steve Potts back through time to interrupt him. Hello, I'm an insurance salesman from Porlock, we say.
So tangential to time travel is alternate history. So we've all heard the thing where is considering all the options. There's a lot of cognitive scientists out there who believe that free will is an illusion, and when you looked at that menu, you ordered the roast beef because you're predetermined to order the roast beef. So if both these guys are right, where do you get your alternative dimensions from?
It's the problem again we have is this logical, almost mechanical insistence upon infinities. When we look at what Richard Feynman was talking about and so on, about proliferation from every point of expanded pathways for particles and so on, they all collapse along the most efficient solution. So there's some weird sort of judgmental or algorithmic thing going on here in the universe if we believe these energy pathways. Let's say it's not an infinite number of things. If it is, it's quickly reduced to the most efficient. Or, let's get all science fictional on our ass here, the most interesting. So all the solutions for particles are endlessly, every single branching particle every single time does this, but quickly collapses to perhaps the most interesting thing, which means you can't go backwards because you have to recreate all of those pathways and figure out the decision point. You can't do that. The energy required is vaster than the creation of the universe, maybe not a trillion universes or an infinite number of universes. That's the one thing that scares me about time travel, is thinking about reversing Feynman physics is really difficult to do. You cannot determine the decision point. If you can't determine the decision point in any energy solution, in any mechanical engineering solution you can imagine, then you have a universe that is not predictable and may change according to the whims of what you're doing at the time, whether or not that's more interesting. Now this cannot be quantified mathematically in physics, but I think as a religious idea, it's pretty damn cool.
There is a generally deprecated scientific theory for parallel universes, Everett's physics, and there may be some point for a a science fiction writer with a thoroughly professional background in physics, such as one person sitting on this panel, to sitting at the other end of the panel. Not that I've been naming names. That I suspect there are things in Everett's outlook that constrain the parallel world situation. In other words, some people, when they think parallel worlds, are thinking of every possible difference in infinitely many gradations, which has led to some cool stories like Greg Egan, where an assassin doesn't try to kill an opponent, which would just be one timeline, measure zero of the whole space, but endeavors to kill his opponent across an almost everywhere subset of all the spaces, leaving the spaces where the enemy still survives to be a probability zero. It may be, on the other hand, that a careful look at Everett's ideas will show that really there's only a few possibilities that are feasible, and that would cause an entirely different sort of story. So I think there actually is hard science, not that I'm claiming that the parallel worlds are a true thing, but from the standpoint of hard science fiction, I think there are some real possibilities of doing much harder versions than have been done in the past.
And I think Ray Benford attempted that in Timescape, of course, where he has, you have quantum messages, just tachyons being sent back, not bodies, not people, just messages. And it actually changes the future in the novel. And you have this kind of split at the end. But I once asked Ray Benford, did he really accept the idea of parallel universes? And he said, nah. It's just too wasteful of matter and energy. You couldn't have that much matter and energy in the universe.
I took an organic view of all of this at City at the end of time. That's why I said physics just doesn't make a lot of sense in this area. You've got infinities and all that kind of crap. Let's talk about the universe as at least a self-organizing principle. And in City at the End of Time, the universe is an aging organism at some point. Except when it is aging and dying, that effect passes back through time. So you're decaying from the back forward, which means you have not original sin, but destined sin.
Mm-hmm.
It comes from it. Sins of the future come back to haunt you, which is a story I've been dealing with since eternity, at least. So what I like about this is it takes us into the fantasy world of what if you manage to go sideways into a doomed universe, an inefficient, a shoddy universe, what they would have called the shoddy lands, perhaps in the C.S. Lewis. So you are in fact in a dead universe that will not last much longer, and you've got to get the hell out of it before it collapses. And how weird is it going to be if it's off the logical timeline, off the energy sufficiency? And I think if you're going to expand into, this is really fertile because it moves you off actually into Lovecraftian territory and all these wonderful, spooky, ghostly territories. And
Creatures from the other dimension.
Pardon?
The creatures from the other dimension.
Right, exactly, kind of outer limits type stuff. And it's infinitely, you can really have fun with this as a crackpot theory, which all alternate universe theories are.
I don't know much about, I know a little bit about string theory and brain theory and all that. Would it be possible for visitors from other brains to come to our universe?
Brains! Well, a lot of this depends upon the fineness of the foam. And Larry Niven, in all the myriad ways, there's a rage of suicides because people realize that the foam of the different universes is down to the individual human decision level. And so more people are thinking about the fact that some parallel of them is going to commit suicide, and so that results in a vast number of suicides, even though it remains low probability. That's intermediate foam, because it's down at the level of the human decision. Then there's the foam level of the Heisenberg decision at the level of the quanta. That's the extreme level of the parallel worlds foaming off. And what do you even do with that notion? Then the opposite extreme of the parallel universes that still has them is what you were referring to with Greg Benford, where everybody on Earth feels a heat. When enough of these messages have gone through and enough, the universe, it has an elastic tendency to restore itself until enough disturbances have come back in time in the communications to make it snap into a new state. I found that, I always found that a very interesting subversion or subversion.
There was a fascinating Nature article about 2 years ago where they talked about the ability of chlorophyll in plants and the chloroplasts to utilize quantum mechanics to move into a more efficient state before it happens or before it's required. And then basically they're collapsing the wave function chemically in quantum within the chloroplast. So plants are actually accessing, in a sense, alternate universes and solving for them in a biological fashion. Now, I hadn't believed in Frank Tipler's idea about neural quantum effects until I read this, and it was a pretty solid piece. It was really fascinating. And now I'm going, Mr. Tipler, maybe I was wrong and you were right. But imagine if time is not a point, but a smear. And so your perception of time is you have a certain period in which to make your decisions, in which you have access to a certain branch of information about the future. And that's how we do it, and that's why some of us perhaps succeed better than others, is evolutionarily, some of us are better at doing this, and it's been built into our evolution since time immemorial, since probably the beginning of chemical processes.
So have we gotten hard SF enough for you? Let's take some things from the audience.
One last technology, and this is one that we don't really, it's not a science fiction trope, but it's a technology that gets abused by science fiction a lot. Language. Better when you go, we speak English, or there's something like a Babelfish that will
Über diese Sache kann ich ziemlich gut sprechen.
Ja, nie pani mają po rusku. Łakacie pani hamburła, skoši haši maska.
Is there a way around facts like the Babelfish?
No.
No? All right.
No.
Audience.
How about dark matter and the uses of dark matter in science fiction?
Yeah, dark matter is kind of becoming the new magic, isn't it?
Or dark energy.
Well, you know, it's perfect for hard, this is what hard science fiction has done all along, though. Taken something that we do 80–90% of the universe. And rising, yeah. I think we should be investing in dark matter. But, no, I know, yes, of course. But I think it's a perfect place for, and it's going to get abused until we know more about it.
I think it's very amusing that at the same time that we are puzzled by dark matter, we also entertain the Fermi paradox. I mean, what do you think industrial pollution looks like?
It's all these star drives, it's all the waste material from all these star drives. Going into finally they just burned themselves out, and now we're just the bacteria.
It's cosmic smog.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh,
As somebody who's been in this field for quite some time, I have to tell you that, you know, it disturbs me that the people who would get the first phone calls, if there were ever a trace of contact with the aliens, would be a very, very close-minded bunch we have in Palo Alto at the SETI Institute, who I've been having a bunch of tussles with. And a couple of people there would do their very best to make sure that no science fiction people were involved in the committees to discuss possibilities. When we have access to this vast library of, oh, you know what? This reminds me of a thought experiment that was done by Hamilton, and it disturbs me that it's possible that we might not get the phone call.
On the other hand, a lot of government agencies come to science fiction writers, A, because they want to meet them and get their autographs, and B, because they have a hell of a lot of fun talking to them, and they don't have a lot of fun talking to some of these other folks. They basically find it to be crashing bores.
In terms of science fiction reflecting the beliefs of the era, sort of like the general psychology of the era, do you think that we're going to be in a period of really pessimistic dystopian novels, or is it going to be shiny, bright, happy futures?
I think we are, aren't we?
Yeah, there's too many dystopian novels.
But still, there's going to be a downward.
The proportion has always been on the dark side. If we look say, where are all the utopian, prophylactic novels telling us where we should go? Stanley Robinson is a baseball socialist who's done a lot of these things and really cool books. And then he's probably one of our few consistently, well, there's dystopian novels and there's realistic novels. So when I write realistic novels. So a book like Queen of Angels is neither great nor terrible. It's not a dark future, it's just a future that's human. And I think a lot of science fiction falls into that. But if you expect either or, if you expect great positivism, then you're going to look for Walden. You've got to look for B.F. Skinner's Walden, or you've got Walden 2, or you've got to look for an occasional good one. I think of Stand on Zanzibar, which is not a dystopian novel at all, but Sheep Look Up is.
Island by Huxley.
Yeah, which is really strange, interesting novel.
Yes, the Dune utopia, but it's a utopia.
But it's very hard to do a prescriptive utopia without getting ranty. And we see this, alas, in a great many of the works in the feminist SF community, where they're all built on holocausts. Some horrible holocaust has happened, and then the author prescribes how things ought to be. And it's unfortunate because it's a lovely area to do thought experiments, altered sexuality, altered gender rules.
So you look at 7 Days in New Crete for a really interesting utopian look at the feminist utopia.
Or Herland by Gilman.
You also don't read a lot of books where everyone's happy and nice to each other.
No, I was thinking about that
And
because
for literary reasons, it's hard to write utopian for that reason.
Yeah, I mean, so would you sit and watch a Star Trek movie in which everybody got along? Period.
Well, that's Star Trek
there were no fights.
Generations.
Yeah, I know. Yes, and that's exactly.
Every episode ends on a relaxing note.
Okay, kind of branching off of Star Trek. Another sci-fi trope I want to talk about: teleportation.
That means getting killed at your end and rebuilt at the other.
Although there have been some really, really tasty science fiction in which you're going to beam yourself to the spaceship out there that's approaching it's approaching the nose star system empty, and then you beam yourself aboard to be a colonist, and then you get off the transporter and go on with your life. You're not destroyed; it's just a duplicator.
Cool idea we can throw out here. You just send your mind, and your body is turned into a hamburger.
You said the ugliest part of
It
your
becomes
body.
fast food. You need to have enough people coming and going so you can equal out.
It's your mind.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. We're doing Frank Zappa here. Nobody interrupts the zap.
Anyone else?
What do you guys think of Ron L. Hubbard as a science fiction author?
Very successful.
The great Elvis Ron he was quite a good pulp writer back in the day. He was really quite amazing. He wrote some really classic pulp.
He was the master, so to speak.
Yeah, he was the master. And then he decided at some point, and Ken Kruger, one of our mentors here, affirms this story last time I talked to him at the Felipe's here. He says, oh yeah, there was a point where Ron Hubbard said, this science fiction writing, this pulp writing is a mug's game. We got to create a religion.
Well, wasn't there supposedly an evening with Van Vogt and Campbell and Heinlein and Hubbard?
No, Ken was the one who's perhaps the source of this story, unless it was Carl Ellison, I don't know. There's been some versions of it, but Ken says, no one believes me that this is the way it was. And he was pretty sharp at that point. So he was like 17 or 18 years old, or maybe 20, 22, 23. And he was in a room, and I don't know whether Van Vogt and all the other group were there. Heinlein, perhaps not. But Heinlein and Hubbard remained in sort of loose contact over the years. And Heinlein had Hubbard's phone number to call up until the 80s, at least. The sad thing about Hubbard was he really did he wanted to have his rosebud back again. And that's why he was so tired of all this crap he had created, that he wanted to isolate the Scientology side from the Brit publication side. And he wanted to be able to go back to those days at science fiction conventions when he was just good pulp.
And that's our time.
Oh.
Thank you, everybody.